The best pick in every round of fantasy football for 2024. That's what we're going to talk about on today's edition of RotoViz Overtime. We are talking it through, and I think a fun way, Shawn. We are going to draft a $125 FFPC Best Ball Tournament over at the FFPC website, myffpc.com, and we're hoping to get first place in this, Shawn. We have a second place finish a couple of seasons back. We're still awaiting that top spot bragging rights that we're hoping to get this year. So we have the 106. We're going to do the conversation through the draft format, and then what we're going to do is talk about each round, which pick was the best, talk through our picks, obviously, but also talk through kind of some of the other players that we haven't been able to draft. Maybe a player we really wanted to get to us, but we were sniped a couple of picks ahead of time, and talk through it that way, more so from just the players that we select. So as we get ready, Shawn, to kick this one off, we have 2 rounds in the books. We're going to start talking through those and then make our picks as we work through. But how are you doing as we kick off what is, I believe, our first $125 entry co-managed of the season?
Good. As you mentioned, I mean, this is a format we absolutely love. Strongly encourage everybody to get out there and get yourself a team or two. We've got fantastic tools up on the site for it. I have the BBT strategy guide in a couple of different parts that helps you figure out how to dominate the BBT. Colm, we've already made a pick that doesn't exactly fit with that, but it fits with another article that I wrote in the last week talking about how Kyren Williams is maybe the best price, the most undervalued player since LaShawn McCoy all the way back in 2016. We were in a little bit of an uncomfortable area of the draft there in the middle of round 2, where Drake London was the pick if you're going to go wide receiver, and yet it would have given us 2 receivers to start with the same bye. It's also a case where Kyle Pitts is probably the slam dunk way to play that team. I'm kind of hoping that he comes back to us in round 3. Dalton Kincaid is who we will normally pick in this spot, but we've been picking a lot of Kincaid in the various formats we've been playing over the last week and a half. I just kind of wanted to shake things up a little bit here and highlight that article as well. I think that the threat to Williams, not that it's overstated, but when we look at it in context, he's being penalized in a way a lot of other running backs aren't. But Colm, one of the foundation points from the BBT strategy guide, you really want to get in there and get Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, or Bijan Robinson. And if you don't, you probably want to wait until round 6 or later. We didn't accomplish either of those 2 things, but we do have one of the 2 backs who scored over 20 points per game last season, and we got him in round 2.
Yeah, we did. And we will talk through some of those picks because I think it's interesting at this point of the year as to how we're building out these rosters and our exposures potentially to players or lack thereof. And I'm doing some co-managed drafts at the moment. I might touch on them in a minute, where I'm like kind of thinking maybe it is time to dip into the other side of that bet from time to time. So balancing things out. We are going to be up against Shawn in 1 pick. So we'll do that pick. Then we'll talk through some of our selections and then the best picks off those rounds as we get ready to move forward here. We are in a spot where now we have 1 running back, 1 wide receiver. This is a place where you can start 4 wide receivers, but you also have the tight end premium element. One of the players, or 2 of the players that we could have taken were both tight ends that have gone off the board since our last selection, and Dalton Kincaid and Mark Andrews. It did feel like maybe you can sneak Kyle Pitts back to us, which we have been able to do in this particular situation. You mentioned him a moment ago. That is kind of where I was at with that last pick, being able to see who comes through. I think the ability to add him to the roster at this point here makes it too much to pass up. But with us going there with the running back, which is usually, we will do some drafts, it'll be a hero RB build, but through those opening 3 rounds, was there any temptation for you to, as we do take Kyle Pitts, go the other direction with a Devontae Smith? Obviously, Malik Neighbors, as we record this, some conversation around the status of his potential injury. Maybe it's only a niggle, maybe it's a little bit more, but that obviously maybe puts the brakes on picking him at that particular spot right now. But any temptation there to get that second wide receiver, or just an easy smash pick there on Kyle Pitts?
No, I think you can definitely go with the receiver there. I think that Chris Olave, Cooper Kupp, both fantastic selections. Jaylen Waddle, you're probably hoping comes back to you in round 3. Nico Collins goes right before our pick. Neighbors versus Pitts, if we had taken Dalton Kincaid, we would have gone with Malik Neighbors there at the 306.
Yeah.
Because we went ahead and made the decision to pass on Kincaid and hope that Pitts got back to us, which one of the questions we were asked recently on the mailbag, and we did a decent segment on for the show. Definitely encourage anybody to check that out if they are interested. But this middle of the draft range gives you a great opportunity to scoop up values, whether those are ADP values or rankings values. Either thing can be very, very helpful, right? So to be able to get Ja'Marr Chase in the middle of round 1, there are some risks with him at this point, but there is still a big tier break between him and I think you could argue Justin Jefferson at pick 7, certainly before A.J. Brown at pick 10. That part is fantastic because then as you come back in round 2, you can make that play for Kyren Williams, or you can take either McBride or Kincaid. You love to have, you don't actually get that option. We didn't get both of those guys today, but one of them will almost certainly be there. You can do that and then come back with your receiver, or you can play it the opposite way, which we did here, which is to take sort of a running back luxury pick, come back with the tight end. And then one of the things that shows up in the Roster Construction Explorer, which you can check out over on RotoViz, is that even in this format where it's a 2-2-2, so dramatically different than the 2-3-1, but you have the 2-2-2 format, you have tight end premium. Tight ends are very important, but also still getting that group of receivers. The nice thing about the format, though, is that receivers are priced in a way that you can put that elite group together without quite as much pressure as you might have in some other formats.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, to make to flip that switch from some of the super flex drafts that we've shared with listeners recently, and the way that you can build them out, and particularly again with knowing where those roster spot allocations will go. We will have a bit of time as it mixes back. Shawn made a good point where, the players we had hoped to maybe get back to us with some of those values. One of those, Shawn, was George Kittle, who I added to the queue. He went, he didn't make it back to us. We'll jump into round 1 though, Shawn, and think about the players that, we did take Ja'Marr Chase, and that was the ADP pick and Shawn's ranking pick by that particular round. We looked through that board though, Shawn. I have to say that, Chase is a really nice pick. I probably think that getting Tyreek Hill at 4 is something that's very interesting, or getting Bijan Robinson at 5. Have you a pick that you can highlight as the best pick off that particular round?
Well, we're just going to look at Garrett Wilson at
and hype him up.
11. Yeah. I mean, that's going to be the best pick of the round, right? Because the other picks were automatic. I mean, this is a pick where maybe Garrett Wilson was automatic after Jonathan Taylor, Amon-Ra, A.J. Brown are all gone. But he was the focus of the piece I wrote on how you win with a bad draft slot. And Colm, the thing that was very gratifying, again, doesn't mean that we're going to always hit, but you look back over the last 4 years and our selections or articles on the players you need to target at the 1-2 turn if you get that bad draft slot, they've led to really high finishes in best ball and really high finishes in the FFPC main event. I'm encouraged that the evidence-based approach that we use with those picks has been successful. One of the things that is kind of crazy is there's a 140-point difference in fantasy points over expectation for Garrett Wilson and CeeDee Lamb last year. Blair Andrews had a piece on Saturday, I believe, snuck in there looking at 5 receivers who are going to explode. He was approaching Garrett Wilson from a completely different direction there. Wilson is one of the 5. We really like him. I encourage people to dive into the weeds on that because I went into quite a bit of detail with Garrett Wilson. I'm not saying that you should select him ahead of guys like Ja'Marr Chase and Justin Jefferson, in part because you need to have somebody you can pick when you have a bad draft slot. But he is someone who could compete with those players when we look at the full season scoring for 2024. Someone who could be this year's CeeDee Lamb and next year go at the 102. Colm, Zay Flowers goes right ahead of us here. That interesting and a little bit disappointing. There are QBs, there are running backs. Michael Pittman. I think I would prefer to reach down the board a little bit and get DJ Moore, someone we're not normally drafting because his price doesn't normally work. Do you have other names that you see that you want to prioritize here?
No, I'm kind of into the DJ Moore, Stephon Diggs range. The quarterbacks are interesting because they're slightly after ADP, but I still think I would go in that other direction, and we'll take DJ Moore. And I think it sets us up a little bit for that conversation maybe after we work through round 2 and round 3 to talk about the best picks, because that is something that I've been leaning much more into over the last couple of weeks, is making sure that I'm not just, stuck in one take or stuck in one thought of how the season will play out. So we'll talk about him because listeners will know we've been drafting quite a large portion of Keenan Allen in our drafts in round 2, Shawn. And I think for the listeners, wondering how that question was set up for round 1, I think that's called, setting Shawn up to let us know why we should be drafting Garrett Wilson, because I was very, very tempted to take Garrett Wilson at 6. But as Shawn mentioned, and I've touched on this a few times recently, you're going to get draft slots in the 10, 11, 12 where you will be getting your draft exposure to him at those points. Round 2, you mentioned Chris Olave when we got to round 3. I would have loved if Trey McBride got one more pick. He went one spot before us in round 2. We took Kyren Williams at that point. I think looking at how that draft and how that round played out, he is the player who stands out for me. I think Achane is interesting at his point at the 211, but for me, Trey McBride would be the clear best selection at ADP in a tight end premium format in that second round. Is he the same for you, or is there another name that you like in that particular round?
Well, we give Trey McBride so many compliments that
because
I do want to go in a different. I mean, he's the best pick, right? But I want to go in a different direction and look at either Chris Olave, who I think probably should be going ahead of Puka and Marvin Harrison. And especially when we look at the BBT, that means you're talking about 2 ends of the round, right? Marvin Harrison and Puka went 201, 202. The other point I would
make, I think in non-tight end premium, Shawn, he should be gone before the 204 in every draft, and that's not the case because you can get him, in the mid to late rounds sometimes, and even in Best Ball Mania.
And I think there's a very strong argument that our team would end up being better if we had taken Chris Olave instead of Kyren Williams. The other name I want to float, though, is Jahmyr Gibbs. As I worked through the Kyren Williams piece last week, one of the things that also starts to creep in for you is that Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, their backups are probably better than David Montgomery. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be used in the same way. We've already watched what Detroit's plan is with their 2 running backs, and Montgomery will be involved. And yet the other thing that we want to keep in mind is that year 2 is where we can probably expect Gibbs to make that big leap. And he was already so good. And the thing that's a little bit odd and that you want to be aware of, be concerned about, but also maybe have a little bit of optimism for, is the EP profile for Gibbs, even sharing so much of the work with David Montgomery, was pretty good. Now, it's still a big concern in terms of being able to maintain a pie that is that size. And yet, as we've worked through some of the positive contextual elements for the Denver Broncos, we've talked about the size of the pie. Certainly when you're taking Achane, when you're taking Jaylen Wright, the size of the pie matters there. When we look at Detroit and this talent gap between Gibbs and Montgomery, I mean, Gibbs is priced to, toward the top end of what he can realistically bring for you without a David Montgomery injury, but a David Montgomery injury is possible. The other thing is just, I do still really like Hall and Robinson in round 1. I'm not going to be making the suggestion that you should avoid those guys. I'm working back around to the idea, though, that maybe the gap between Hall, Robinson, and then to Gibbs is not as much as history would tell us, that most of the evidence would tell us. So I'm going to say that Gibbs is the best pick in round 2. Colm, we are back on the clock in round 5, and Stephon Diggs has come all the way to us.
Yeah, we make it the best pick around 5, Shawn. Diggs was somebody I was floating with the DJ Moore pick, so I think it's a clear pick here to take both of those guys. Interesting as well, I did see on, I like to update Shawn on these shows on social media, a lot of conversation on social media about Stephon Diggs talking with CJ Stroud in preseason, and that it seemed that he was very disappointed that it wasn't him catching that deep touchdown, but people like to blow these things up. He should not be falling to these points in drafts, but that is kind of around the range that he goes. Generally, though, I'm seeing him go a little bit earlier in most of these particular situations, usually at the back end around 4. So to get him there a couple of picks later is very, very nice. I have to highlight the drafter in the 102s off to an interesting start. Gets Lamar Jackson along with Mark Andrews, who also has CeeDee Lamb on that roster, and paired with 2 interesting running backs. I mentioned Achan a moment ago. He's on that particular squad, but that was a nice pick for us, Shawn. I was also adding Tank Dell to the queue in case it did get to that point. It's going to be interesting to look back at the end of the season. He goes 1 pick later as to how some of these offenses with close proximity and ADP end up splitting things out. But I'm looking forward to seeing, I'm sure Shawn is hoping here that maybe a Brock Bowers sneaks his way back in. But, when you're in this point of the draft, if you're drafting at the start of the round, I really feel like when you take Diggs there, you have zero chance of getting a Stroud back. Now, I will highlight that I mentioned that the draft rafters took Dell, so that kind of eliminates that, I think, anyway. But it is interesting, with that Diggs selection, when we talked about him potentially in the last round, you do see some of those where you can scoop them up that little bit and get an opportunity then. Brock Bowers did go. I can hear Shawn's, tear ducts activating as that pick went in. Shawn, pick round, or the best pick in round 3 as we look to it before we get back. We'll almost be caught up at that particular point. There is interesting names, and I think when you get to the point where Mark Andrews, Kincaid, McBride, Kelsey, and Laporta are all gone, we took Kyle Pitts. I think he really fits into this, but I also think just based on ADP value, if that was Kincaid or if that was Andrews and the others had gone, I think getting the tight end of that kind of profile at that point of the draft is perfect in this format. The other player who I was hoping would be the name I would nominate for round 4, he's not going to make the cut in this one because George Kittle did go at the 401 in this one. But I think that when you see Mark or Evan Ingram go at the 311, Kyle Pitts, and people will again scoff at this, I'm sure, because of what they both did last season and how those seasons went. But I would like, much prefer to have Kyle Pitts for the upside for this season. But going through those picks, Shawn, I think that even with the injury, Malik Neighbors' ceiling is just so intriguing in that mid-3rd round. But I find that the second round where we hinted at multiple names, you mentioned Gibbs, I mentioned McBride, you talked about Olave, I kind of hinted at Achan. When we look at the players that are going in the 3rd round, the second round is obviously a much more appetizing. And I think then we start to get into players who become better values at ADP in 3rd and 4th round versus what we're seeing in that 3rd round. We are nearly on the clock, but who is your 3rd round MVP?
I'm going to go with, Cooper Kupp is the best value. I'm going to go with Jaylen Waddle, right? Let's say that this is the big breakout season for him. The Dolphins have added some weapons, but it's still going to be those 2 guys. A little bit of a tweak to how the Dolphins offense manifests, and Jaylen Waddle is a massive home run selection there in the middle of round 3. Colm, we get a couple of quarterbacks come off the board right ahead of us, including CJ Stroud, who would have been at least a mildly interesting pick. That puts us into a range that is maybe not as much fun. We could go with the 2nd Chicago Bears receiver here. My preference would probably be to go ahead and grab a 2nd running back at this point, and probably Aaron Jones or James Conner.
Out of those 2, I'd prefer Connor. I would be interested in stacking out the Bears if you wanted to do that, but I'm going to leave you to the clock. Shawn, there's 9 seconds left when you turned that over to me.
Yeah, so plenty of time. You had no problem. You gave me both the player and the tactic, and I did go with the player. I think we want to spread these Bears bets a little bit, which doesn't mean that we couldn't go back with it, but I want to make sure we're managing those buys as well. We have so much exposure to Keenan Allen. I would love for this team to be the one that plays out DJ Moore as the massive smash. If you take both of those guys, it does at least mildly increase the chances that you will be able to get Caleb Williams at a discount. And we already have a drafter here who has taken CJ Stroud despite
Mahomes.
already having Patrick Mahomes and not having any of the Texans receivers. So it's something to keep in mind that in this $125 level entry, you're going to get a wide variety of approaches, and maybe more so
Shawn,
than the...
You mentioned that draft. That drafter did start off Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, so there's some pay up there, but they did take Patrick Mahomes. It wasn't that drafter I was worried about taking CJ Stroud. It was the drafter after that. So I'm sure that drafter is also probably number 7, taking that a little bit harder. But yeah, you will see all different approaches, but we'll see what they do if they add even more additional quarterbacks throughout. But it's always that thing of, these things can play out even when you think that you have the advantage of, stacking up a team and maybe getting a little bit of a discount. I am interested, though. We now have 2 running backs through 6 rounds, which definitely not the usual approach. And what's going to happen is I'm sure, Shawn, we're going to have a little bit of a different team than we would be building out normally, because we're going to have to work past, I think, some of the running back options potentially in that perfect 0 RB window. But we will have a fun team here as we move on through the rest of the way. Moving into round 4, Shawn, I mentioned that George Kittle is often my priority target in tight end premiums, whether it's the Superflex or this, but round dependent, obviously, if it's in the Superflex format. Zay Flowers went 1 pick before. I thought he was going to be very, very interesting as well. But I do think that as much as we've been drafting Keenan Allen, DJ Moore at that point is interesting. But I think Zay Flowers is the upside pick of that particular round. Devontae Smith goes, but it's the early 4th. I think Flowers heading into that second season, and there was signs down the stretch that they were starting to use him a little bit further down the field. I think that continues to happen. And while it would seem that he was more involved, without Mark Andrews, I do think, a pitch I make quite often is having good players on the field makes it harder for defenses to put their coverage your way. So, yeah, I think the rocket ship's about to leave the station with Zay Flowers.
Yeah, we've drafted a lot of Flowers. The secondary breakout opportunity for him, even in an offense that probably will not support multiple receivers at as high a level as some others. Again, you can check out Blair's full breakout wide receiver series, but specifically the article on secondary breakouts will get you pretty fired up for Zay Flowers. There's another player here who, despite concerns about his spot in the pecking order, Jaden Reed would actually qualify as a secondary breakout after he hit 200 points as a rookie. Colm, we are 1 pick away, and both Reed and Worthy are here. One of these 2 guys is almost certainly going to be the pick.
Yeah, and Reed went. I was going to say that we would take Reed and hope that we pushed it around and were able to then get ourselves Worthy after that point. Worthy, I think, has a chance to come back to us. I know he's somebody you want to get in the roster. I do think we need to prioritize a wide receiver at this spot. Joe Burrow's there as well to potentially go with Chase, but I think we'll push it further in that direction. So I think that it's Worthy. The other player, I don't even know if I was going to pitch him. It was Reed that I wanted. I do think Christian Watson's reports from training camp, even though I continually say that I don't know his hamstrings are actually going to be fixed, I think that he is a good player when Reed has gone, and then you're into this tier. But yeah,
you were saying Worthy come back around.
I'm gutted with that Reed pick. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we were hoping for Reed. You were saying Worthy come back around. I don't think that he would have with the injury to Brown and the fact that
that's the other point.
So I have the ADP tool pulled up for the last more or less 4 days. So very updated ADP. That is 56 drafts in this tournament. So quite a bit of volume. That was showing Worthy as the 709. Given what's happened since, I don't think that there really would have been any chance to get him back. I might lean to him just slightly over Reed.
That was the question I was going to ask then. I think if I had to pick one, I would lean Worthy. But I looking at ADP. I was going, but your point of the last couple of days, now that I've updated the grid here, is also true.
But Jaden Reed, just an absolute smash. I mean, the other concern there, or just possible selection, would have simply been to go with JSN. He doesn't make it back to us in round 8. That is, again, not a surprise. His ADP was at 803. We would have needed him to fall a little bit to get to us at the 807. Didn't get close.
Did not get close at all. And again, it'll be fun to look back after and see, those picks where we have gone to the running back position, because although the FFPC in the past has been somewhere where it is not maybe as wide receiver heavy as, let's say, Underdog because of the roster settings, I do think that wide receiver has gone pretty heavy as we work through this draft, and, looking at ADP, pretty heavy across the market as well there. So one of the things I would have been interested in is, getting Love and then seeing if Watson had come back to us potentially for that one. That doesn't come into play either. But I did mention Joe Burrow at that last pick. He would now be around beyond ADP. If he came back, could be a potential pivot if there's not wide receivers out. This is the area, Shawn, where we're generally looking towards the running back position with lots of interesting names here. And maybe that is the way that we'll end up having to go as we work through it here. To jump back, though, to our show topic, I guess, back into, we are up to, at this particular point, round 5, I believe. We'll do these a little bit quicker working through it. But, Shawn, we took Stefon Diggs, who we talked about at round 4. I think that he is my pick. The player that Shawn may pick is Brock Bowers, but I had aspirations, Shawn, that he may have got back to us at the mid-6th round. You can tell me the reasons as to why I'm completely out of my mind for that idea and why he is the best pick of the round.
Yeah, I mean, it's Brock Bowers. He's gonna be like the tight.
Who's the best pick of the first round, Shawn? It's Brock Bowers.
Brock Bowers. No, looking at round 5, I don't love that round, so I'm just go ahead and give it to Bowers. We can do that one a little bit more quickly. As you mentioned, Colm, most of the picks in round 5 are a little bit landmine-ish, which, again, doesn't mean that they couldn't work. I love in round 6, I think you could make the case that even though he goes at the beginning, and so most drafters didn't get a shot at him, T. Higgins is the best pick in round 6. Colm, we do have to make our selection before we continue the conversation. For me, this is between Jameson Williams and Jordan Addison. Are you seeing other names that you want to throw into the mix?
No. Structure-wise, they are the 2 picks. And I have been enough recent times leaning towards Williams. That was more so I was drafting a lot of Addison before the first set of news came out, so I'm good with Addison as well. I'm happy to let you make the selection of which one you prefer.
Well, let's see if we can get him into round 9. The
question here I'm just going to ask on it with this one is, we obviously take Jameson Williams. We are in I mentioned the 0 RB picks, Jonathan Brooks, Chase Brown, Javonte Williams, Tajay Spears, lots of names here we would normally be jumping to grab if we had not drafted running back so far. Well, maybe we'll get to that conversation after, because we're kind of reaching, additional rounds to get up to that player. And that is part of the reason Addison probably will come back to us, as we are kind of skipping over a range. It'll be good to talk about that roster construction, I guess, when we get to the end of this draft, and we'll try and catch up on the best player of each round conversation for the time being. Round 6, Shawn, looking through it, we skipped on Keenan Allen, who we've talked about drafting a lot. James Conner is one of the players who falls into that conversation as to should we have gone running back or not. I tend to like a lot more players in round 5 and round 7 than I do in round 6. And I think maybe that's the reason why it goes to that kind of Keenan Allen or James Conner kind of lean towards a pick of, some upside, but perceived safety as well in those ranges. And that's why when I was mentioning, if Stroud came back, for example, he would be interesting in that round. It feels like an area where it gets a little bit flatter. Who's your standout player in round 6?
I'm going to go with T. Higgins. I think the other possibility there is Rashee Rice. The other pick for me, other than James Conner, would have been to reach into round 7 for Deontay Johnson. I think if you make the case for Deontay instead of James Conner and then swap one of those running backs that you mentioned for Jameson Williams in round 8, that probably gives you a slightly stronger overall team. I think the willingness to say there are so many good wide receiver values in this format, and it also does allow you to go ahead and just take a guy around early, because in round 7, you can only make one pick, right? We would have loved to have had Jaden Reed, but if Reed had made it to us, we would have only been able to take one of Reed, Worthy, and JSN. That means that Deontay Johnson just further complicates that and creates more congestion. If he does make it, just go ahead and take him at your pick in round 6, and you end up better off overall. That kind of leads me to, well, I'm going to go with JSN as my favorite pick, or the best pick in round 7. But I think the Deontay Johnson there, to pick two guys at the beginning of rounds is a little bit unfair. But Higgins at the 602 and Johnson at the 702, those are both really good picks.
Yeah, and I mentioned Addison would get back to us. He doesn't. He goes at the 902. I'm going to make a bold prediction, Shawn, that the decision that changed the entire draft was the DJ Moore pick, because I think we probably take Keenan Allen over James Conner if we don't have DJ Moore at that particular point. But we'll look at that after, and then that would have changed what we do at the running back position moving through. Addison did go. As we move on, we have 2 picks, one more pick, in fact, before our next selection, which gives us those running back names again, and then we lean into some of the potential wide receivers. But we are kind of, Shawn, beyond that cliff now, unless there's a wide receiver you want to pitch for to add to the roster. Somebody that I've been adding to a lot of rosters recently is TJ Hawkinson. I don't know if he's somebody that you're interested in drafting to add as a second tight end, or we have those running back names that we discussed. How are you wanting to play this? I probably, because we have the 2 running backs, would lean Hawkinson, but I'm good with some of those running back names as well.
Yeah, let's go ahead and go with Hawkinson here. It sounds like he is going to be available in the first half of the season. Jake Bose has a fantastic article out talking about taking zeros in best ball and how much that does hurt you. I think that the counter here is that TJ Hawkinson, if you get to the fantasy playoffs with him, it's essentially like having an additional 3rd round pick in round 9. You know, maybe he doesn't play as well. Maybe he gets back and it's slower going, especially when you consider the quarterbacks they're going to have at their disposal this season. And yet at this point, I think there's probably room for some optimism on Sam Darnold and JJ McCarthy. Not that you would necessarily be attacking them specifically, but where you're not going to completely ignore their weapons. Colm, right before us, Chase Brown went. I was looking at Javonte Williams and really wanting to make that click. Those were guys we considered when we made the Jameson Williams selection. This has worked out very nicely, though, because we have the mix that we're looking for with 5 receivers, 2 running backs, both of whom appear to be pretty undervalued. And then you have the 2 standout tight ends. One of the things that has happened in this draft is that 12 QBs have gone. 3 teams already have 2 quarterbacks. We're going to have to keep an eye on that just so we don't get completely locked out. But when we have managers reaching for QB here, it does open up possibilities for the other squads to build super teams if they're able to then hit on their own QBs later.
That is absolutely correct. And it is nudging some players potentially towards us. Like Javonte Williams in this draft went at the 9-10. I think that's an outstanding play if you can get him in that particular range. He usually is obviously going a good bit earlier than that. But when we look through the team, as you mentioned, the 2 tight ends, the 2 running backs, if you flip the order now, we're starting to get to that area where we have some of that wide receiver firepower built into this roster. As I mentioned at the start, you can start 4. You can also start 4 running backs if you want to draft in that particular direction. But it does mean that if Hawkinson and Pitts were hitting down the stretch, you can also start multiple tight ends. So we're approaching into round 10, the end of round 9, though, Shawn. Jonathan Brooks, Javonte Williams, Tyjae Spears, all going off back-to-back, which are all very, very nice selections at that particular point. We are up at this point now, Shawn, to round 8. So maybe we'll try and do round 8 and round 9 here, nice and quick together. Shawn obviously mentioned the pick of JSN. Interesting, he didn't say that Worthy was the best pick of the round when we made that pick 3 picks before the JSN pick. But we have some very nice upside plays in that particular range of the draft. And you mentioned Hollywood Brown. He did still go at the 703 in this particular draft. Moving into the 8th and 9th round, we have some more quarterbacks that went off the board. But this is an area where we're usually leaning in, for me anyway, into the running back position. I like drafting Jaylen Warren out of the group of running backs that went in this draft. But I do think that in the situation we were in, if you're approaching that wide receiver cliff, and I mentioned that by ADP, there was some of the wide receivers that might have got back to us. But if you don't take Williams there, Shawn, you really start to get boxed out at the position. So I do like the Jameson Williams pick there based on the strategic need. Based on how I'm normally drafting, the player I'd be hoping that gets to me there would be a Jaylen Warren, or else I'm into the situation where I'm pulling up one of the crew of Chase Brown or Javonte Williams, Jonathan Brooks into the back end of that round 8. So I think that Williams or Warren is the way that I am going 80% of my drafts. Is there any other names? Brian Thomas is somebody I've seen. I think you mentioned him, and maybe in our this was offline when we were talking about our Dynasty startup draft, if he was somebody I was interested in. The rookies in here, Keon Coleman, him, Adunze, Lad McConkey, lots of rookies in this range. Any of those that you want to highlight that you're interested in, or are you tending to go with Williams a lot here and maybe Warren?
I think that Williams, he's just the most fun way to play it, and especially in best ball. I think that if you're looking at redraft, you probably need to take Jordan Addison. In best ball, Williams is probably the play. Jaylen Warren is the best pick in round 8. I really love the upside that he brings to the table in that offense with his profile. Just crazy peripherals. Jaylen Warren, probably a top 5 reality running back in the entire NFL, even splitting the work with Harris. He's going to do well. Colm, coming back in round 9, let's go with Tyjae Spears. Everybody, the first 10 picks passed him up. He looked fantastic in preseason week 1. He did split as expected with Tony Pollard, but they were both out there for those drives. They were both getting high value touches. Spears, absolutely electric. Basically the Jaylen Warren play at a full, round and a half discount.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that is I think the most fertile round for getting those running backs that we can have already talked around, so people know that. We did miss out just on Devin Singletary, Shawn, by 1 pick. He's somebody in those 0 RB teams I'm trying to add in. Caleb Williams is here. I've added Luke Musgrave as a potential additional tight end. One player I've drafted quite a bit of recently is Nick Chubb to fit into those injury-riddled teams with TJ Hawkinson for the end of season upside. But are you thinking here of leaning towards Williams as the quarterback, or what is your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think Williams is a pretty easy selection at this juncture. He's got more upside than many of the QBs who have already gone. He's a really nice fit with our particular team. If you make that DJ Moore selection, you need Caleb Williams to play well for that to pay off, because a lot of the other receivers who are going in the round and a half after DJ Moore are going to easily beat him if Caleb Williams doesn't have a big season. Based on how this draft has fallen out from the QB position, I was really nervous that we were going to lose him. I'm surprised actually that he made it to us at that point.
Yeah, and there's only one team with no quarterback so far through those opening 10 picks. So we currently have our first quarterback of Caleb Williams. We have tight ends of Kyle Pitts, TJ Hawkinson, running backs of Kyron Williams, James Conner, then Ja'Marr Chase, DJ Moore, Stephon Diggs, Xavier Worthy, and Jameson Williams. We will be coming back for the second half of the draft where we talk about the must-draft players off those last 10 rounds to build a juggernaut team to try and win your league or to win some of these massive contests. That will be on our next episode. So come back, subscribe, make sure you see that when it is available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. You can check his work up on rotoviz.com. You can also sign up over at rotoviz.com, get yourself a 1-year subscription, and use the code RVRadio2024 at checkout to save 10%. And until we are back, have a good one.